Johnny Cash. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Juan Gonzalez. As the 2012 presidential election season heats up, new campaign finance figures reveal Wall Street is heavily investing in President Obama. According to the Nonpartisan Center for Responsive Politics, the Democratic National Committee and Obama have together raised more than $14 million from the securities and investment industry, compared to nearly $9.5 million contributed to his Republican rival Mitt Romney. This makes Wall Street the third most generous industry donating to Obama's re-election efforts. The news comes amidst ongoing investigations by the Justice Department into massive financial fraud by some of the nation's largest banks. Yet 4 years after the 2008 economic crisis, not a single top Wall Street executive has gone to jail. Well, to look at how the politically powerful enjoy virtual immunity from the consequences of even the most egregious crimes, we're joined here in New York by Glenn Greenwald. Familiar to all Democracy Now! Viewers and listeners, he's a constitutional law attorney and political and legal blogger for Salon.com. He writes about Wall Street's impunity in his book, With Liberty and Justice for Some: How the Law is Used to Destroy Equality and Protect the Powerful, which was released in paperback this week. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Glenn.
Always great to be back.
And before we go to the bankers, it's the 10th anniversary of President Bush's signing of the Patriot Act. And your book, With Liberty and Justice for Some, comes out this week as well. Talk your reflections after 10 years of the Patriot Act and when it's done to the civil liberties of Americans.
This is the most remarkable thing to me about the Patriot Act. When the Patriot Act was first enacted, it was obviously in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And even with the sort of fear and hysteria that was prevailing in the country at the time, the Patriot Act was considered remarkably controversial, even for that time period. When it was enacted, there were all kinds of editorials warning about the surveillance capabilities that we were vesting in the United States that were unique, warnings and concerns about how pervasive the surveillance would become, about how it could be conducted without oversight. It was really a very controversial provision. The Patriot Act had become sort of the symbol of Bush-Cheney radicalism in the way in which the fears of 9/11 and terrorism were being exploited. Fast forward 10 years later, we haven't had another single successful terrorist attack on American soil. And yet now the Patriot Act is completely uncontroversial. It gets renewed every 4 years. Even in the wake of 9/11, the warnings and concerns of it were sufficiently strong that they put in sunset provisions saying, we don't want this to be a permanent state of affairs. It has to be renewed every 4 years. It now gets renewed with no debate. The votes are something like 89 to 10 in the Senate to renew it with no reforms, even though there's massive evidence of systemic abuse. The Democrats and Republicans both renew it when they control Congress. President Obama's administration demanded its renewal without any modifications. And it just goes to show how quickly what's conceived as radical and what is radical becomes so normalized and a permanent fixture in our political landscape. That, I think, is the really disturbing lesson about the Patriot Act.
Well, I wanted to ask you, we've just been talking with Amy about the situation in Spain with Bankia, which looks like it's becoming a combination of Bank of America and Countrywide all rolled into one,
right.
In terms of the its responsibility in the mortgage crisis there in Spain as well. But I want to read through some of the recent settlements that some banks in the United States and in other parts of the world, Barclays, less than a week after agreed to pay $450 million to settle accusations that had tried to manipulate key interest rates. Goldman Sachs agreed to pay $550 million to settle charges of securities frauds, one of the largest penalties against a Wall Street firm by the Securities and Exchange Commission. June 2011, Bank of America announced it would pay $8.5 billion and set aside an additional $5.5 billion to settle claims by investors who bought toxic mortgages from the banking giant. One after another, these banking companies and Wall Street companies keep paying these apparently huge fines, but no one goes to jail.
Right.
No one is prosecuted criminally for these actions.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to realize that although these figures sound large in one sense, $200 million seems like a lot of money, $500 million seems like a lot of money, in the scheme of what these banks are earning across the globe and the magnitude of the fraud, they're really little more than blips on their balance sheets. I mean, they basically end up writing these things off as a cost of doing business, or really more accurately, a cost of doing fraud. The amount of money they've made on their fraudulent activities vastly outweighs the amount they've paid in fines. Now, some of those fines are more significant than that. They're certainly not negligible once you get into the billion-dollar range. But even so, these banks are still extraordinarily profitable. They're in fact making more money in some cases than they even were prior to the 2008 crisis. And so when you look at what the institutional incentives are for banking executives, it is still very much to take these huge risks and gambles, as we saw with, J.P. Morgan and their what might be $9 billion trading losses that were undetected by regulators. And the reason is exactly what you said, which is what is supposed to deter true securities fraud is not that these banks may end up paying some fines institutionally, because that really doesn't provide enough of incentive, obviously, as that list of yours proves. What is really supposed to deter systemic violations of the securities laws is the fact that they're criminal offenses. I mean, Congress made them into felonies in the wake of the Great Depression, and yet there has been zero legal criminal accountability from the financial crisis, and that's the reason that this behavior continues. It's exactly because these executives knew that they could take these huge risks and even break laws and pay no real price, and that's what happened. And it's not just a travesty of justice that we haven't punished them for past transgressions. The real danger is that we're continuing to send the signal to the world's most powerful financial actors that they don't have any fear of criminal accountability when they commit these obvious crimes.
Well, I want to play a comment by President Obama on why his administration has not prosecuted any senior financial executives. He was speaking at a White House press conference in October of last year.
Well, first on the issue of prosecutions on Wall Street. One of the biggest problems about the collapse of Lehman's and the subsequent financial crisis and the whole subprime lending fiasco is that a lot of that stuff wasn't necessarily illegal. It was just immoral or inappropriate or reckless. That's exactly why we needed to pass Dodd-Frank, to prohibit some of these practices. The financial sector is very creative, and they are always looking for ways to make money. That's their job. And if there are loopholes and rules that can be bent and arbitrage to be had, they will take advantage of it. So, without commenting on particular prosecutions, obviously that's not my job, that's the Attorney General's job. I think part of people's frustrations, part of my frustration was a lot of practices that should not have been allowed weren't necessarily against the law, but they had a huge destructive impact.
President Obama on why his administration has not prosecuted any senior financial executives. Your response?
That answer is incredibly deceitful and misleading in several important respects. First of all, the massive orgy of deregulation that took place that let Wall Street do many things that for decades had been criminal took place in the 1990s during the Clinton administration and under Democratic Party control, and was led by people like Larry Summers and the whole acolytes of Robert Rubin, such as Timothy Geithner, who ended up being empowered by President Obama at the highest levels of his economic policy team. So this idea that he is somehow disturbed by or in opposition to the kind of deregulation that made a lot of this behavior uncriminal is incredibly misleading, given that those are the people who continue to run his administration. Secondly, you notice that he said some of this behavior was not criminal. The unspoken implication of it, though, is that much of it was criminal. And in fact, I just did an interview with Eliot Spitzer, who, of course, was probably the only elected official in the last 2 or 3 decades to put serious fear in the heart of Wall Street when he was a prosecutor and attorney general and then governor. And I had said as part of this interview, I know that there's this notion that prosecutions might be difficult of Wall Street executives, but that's not a reason to refrain from doing them. And he actually objected and said, you know what, prosecutions would not be difficult. And he's right. we have emails from Wall Street executives where internally they're mocking the assets that they're representing to the public as being these sterling assets, and they're mocking them as garbage and junk. They knew that they were committing fraud. Credit agencies were purposely shielding these assets, knowing that they were junk as well. And then the third issue that he said was, it's not my job to comment on prosecutions. That's particularly ironic, given that President Obama expressly argued and instructed the Justice Department not to prosecute Bush officials for the crimes that were done as part of the war on terror. He's made comments about Bradley Manning's prosecution and decreed him guilty in public, and yet suddenly when it comes to Wall Street executives who funded his 2008 campaign and are funding his 2012 campaign, he suddenly becomes very shy and reticent and says it's not my job to comment on prosecutions. He's the leader of the party, he's the leader of the country, and the fact that we haven't prosecuted Wall Street executives is one of the greatest national disgraces. You see in Spain, as we heard in that report, some effort to move away from that. That is his responsibility to demand that justice be applied equally. The vow that he made when he announced his presidency, run for the presidency, in the first paragraph of his announcement, he said the era of Scooter Libby justice would be over. Scooter Libby justice means if you're sufficiently powerful, you don't pay a price for your crimes. That was the promise that he made when he ran, and that's the promise that he so woefully failed to fulfill.
Well, I want to ask you about the latest on WikiLeaks, an organization you've written about quite extensively. The organization announced earlier today it was going to release the Syria files, more than 2 million emails from Syrian political figures, ministries, and associated companies, dating from August 2006 to March 2012. Meanwhile, founder Julian Assange has spent the last 2 weeks inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London in an attempt to avoid being extradited to Sweden. Last week, Susan Ben of the Julian Assange Defense Fund said Assange will remain inside the Ecuadorian embassy while his application for asylum is processed.
Yesterday, Mr. Assange was served with a letter from the Metropolitan Police Service requesting that he surrender himself to Belgravia Police Station at 11:30 this morning. Mr. Assange has been advised that he should decline to comply with the police request. This should not be considered any sign of disrespect. Under both international and domestic UK law, asylum assessments take priority over extradition claims.
Glenn Greenwald, your comments on these developments, both the files about to be or being released right now and Julian Assange's current situation.
So as far as his current situation is concerned, I think everybody agrees that the allegations that have been made in Sweden, he's not been charged with any crime. These are just allegations. They're obviously unproven, are serious ones and deserve to be taken seriously. And the hope of everybody is that he will be able to go there and vindicate his claims of innocence or have a judicial process ultimately adjudicate them. The problem is that the United States has given every indication that it is actively seeking to prosecute him. There's some evidence, not overwhelmingly reliable, that there's already a sealed indictment, but there's definite proof that there's an active grand jury. The Justice Department has confirmed there's ongoing criminal investigations. Dianne Feinstein yet again called for the criminal prosecution of WikiLeaks under espionage statutes. And the concern is that going to Sweden will enable the United States much more easily to extradite him to the United States and charge him with crimes for which he would end up in prison for life if convicted under very oppressive conditions. Sweden has a history of complying with the United States' lawless requests. The UN found them in violation of the law in cooperation with the CIA's rendition program. Sweden is a small country, and so what those of us who defend and support WikiLeaks have said, and Julian Assange ultimately said himself, was that the solution is very simple. Simply have the U.S. and Sweden agree that his going to Sweden will not result in his extradition to the United States, and within the next 5 minutes he will get on a plane to Stockholm to go and confront these charges. It's never been about evading those allegations. It's been about not letting the United States engineer his extradition for things that are plainly not crimes, things that the New York Times and other media outlets do every day. As far as this latest release is concerned, I haven't seen the emails. I don't know much about them because the news of this broke as we were beginning the show. But what I would say is it simply underscores the reason that WikiLeaks is so valuable. ability to blow holes in the wall of secrecy behind which the world's most powerful actors function is something that newspapers have a great deal of difficulty doing because they're subject to the laws of their state. They can't guarantee anonymity because reporters know who their sources are and can ultimately be forced to give them up, or surveillance can enable the detection of the sources. And so WikiLeaks created the system.
Because reporters often depend on those very people in power for a lot of the information that they get to publish otherwise.
Absolutely, and when the first thing that the New York Times does when they get leaks is they run to the United States government and ask the government what they should be allowed to publish and what they shouldn't be, and usually they end up complying, as they did when they learned that the Bush administration was secretly spying on Americans. They learned that in mid-2004, but because the Bush administration pressured the publisher and editor of the New York Times to sit on that, they sat on it for a year and a half until Bush was safely reelected and didn't tell us until 2005. They redact large amounts of information, and WikiLeaks doesn't. So it's a crucial model for transparency. From what I can see, this leak implicates both the Assad regime and the opponents in Syria, about which reporting has been very incomplete. Whichever side you are on in the Syria debate, you should want more transparency and more information. And from what I can tell, yet again, WikiLeaks has done what media outlets can't do or won't do, which is shine light on things that are operating in the dark.
I want to ask you about, you're a constitutional law expert. I want to ask you about some recent Supreme Court decisions. Last week, of course, was a big week for the country, and the Supreme Court decision on the Arizona law and as well as on the health care law. Much has been made about Judge Roberts in both of these defecting supposedly from his conservative group of justices, and at least partially on both of these laws upholding the position of many liberals and progressives. Your assessment of the decisions and of the role Judge Roberts played in both of these?
So I think the immigration decision has been misunderstood more so than the other important cases like the campaign finance and healthcare cases, which have received a fair amount of attention. The Obama administration, I think, deserves credit for having sued Arizona and attempted to have the enforcement of that law enjoined. The problem is that although it was depicted as a victory because 3 of the 4 provisions before the court were enjoined, the most significant one, which is the show your papers provision that allows and compels police officers in Arizona to demand that immigration papers or proof of immigration rights be shown basically by anyone they decide they want to demand it of, was upheld. It was upheld on the proviso that if Arizona ends up enforcing it in a discriminatory manner, then they will revisit it, but there's really no way to enforce that provision except in a discriminatory manner. It's inherently discriminatory against Latino citizens in Arizona. And I think, you know, while the Obama administration deserves credit for having brought that suit, the crucial part of why that case ended up being decided that way, that provision ended up being protected, was because the only issue that the Obama administration raised to challenge these provisions was that it was conflicting with federal law and that the federal government has supremacy in these areas.
It chose not to argue.
Right, and the Obama administration didn't raise the argument that it violates the civil rights because it's discriminatory. And you could look at it in one generous way and say, well, they didn't raise that argument because they didn't think the Supreme Court would accept it without there being evidence of how it was being enforced. But I think the real reason is that the Obama administration has been extremely aggressive in deporting people who are undocumented. They have programs where they deputize local sheriff's departments and essentially encourage them to engage in this very behavior. And that was ultimately what Arizona ended up saying, and what 9 justices of the Supreme Court, including Justice Sotomayor, who was expected to be hostile to this law, ended up agreeing with, was that it's very hard to say that what Arizona is doing with the show me your papers provision is in conflict with the federal government, given that the federal government often demands that local police officials do exactly that. So I think, you know, if you talk to Latino advocates and immigration advocates on the ground in Arizona, they'll tell you that this court decision, although depicted as a success, has left the Latino community in substantial fear that this provision, the most pernicious one, can continue to be enforced. As far as the broader question about Justice Roberts, you know, I think that the issue really has been that the Supreme Court is in real danger of losing legitimacy, not with just the right, which has hated the court since Roe versus Wade and the Warren Court, but now with the left. And I think it was crucial that the court demonstrate that not every decision gets decided among strictly partisan lines. And as the Chief Justice, I think he felt it was his particular duty to save the court's reputation.
And in just a few seconds that we have left, you've been going around the country speaking on your book, and now in the paperback with Liberty and Justice for Some. What's been the reaction as you've been going around talking to people, concerns about the inequality of the court systems in America?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Aside from the fact the events are extremely well attended, 500, 600 people to talk about the book, which is not, the typical reaction. I think the reason is that if you look at the protest movements, both on the right and the left, the Tea Party, the Occupy movement, at the core of it was this idea that the system, politically and legally, is completely skewed for those who are most powerful, and that's a core violation of what the American promise was supposed to be.
Well, and that does it for today's program. Glenn Greenwald is a former constitutional law and civil rights attorney and political and legal blogger for Salon.com. His latest book is With Liberty and Justice for Some, How the Law is Used to Destroy Equality, Protect the Powerful. One correction, the Patriot Act was signed into law on October 26,